Hi everybody. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about using macros and user tokens. In this lecture, you will learn about using macros and then about using user tokens. A macro is a set of commands and parameters that can be used multiple times. It is like procedures and functions in programming languages, where you write your code once and use it many times. It is used to simplify and automate the work. You can create the macros in external files, and in this case, they are called micro libraries. And you can share them in the Oracle Golden Gate process parameter files. For example, you can write your column specifications in a micro library file and use it in multiple parameter files. To use macros, first you define them, then you invoke them. You will learn how to do that in the incoming slides. A macro can be defined in the parameter file itself, or it can be defined in its own external file. The slide is showing the syntax that you must follow to define a macro. Macro name must start with macro character. By default, the macro character is the hash sign. You have the option to create parameters for a macro. The parameter name must also start with hash sign. To define parameters for a macro, use the params keyword. You follow that with a begin clause. Write your code, then you end your macro with the end clause. You can call a macro and assign the value it returns to a mapping column. Or you can call a macro as a standalone if it doesn't return any value. When you invoke a macro, you pass values for its parameters between parentheses. The first example in the slide is calling macDate macro and assign its returned value to dateCol1. The second example calls the option defaults macro. That macro doesn't return any value and therefore should be called by itself. Also observe that this macro doesn't take any parameter. This is a full example of defining and calling a macro. The example creates a macro called makeDate. It accepts three parameters, representing year, month, and day. It then converts those parameters into a single date value and returns the value to the caller. This macro is used by the replicate parameter file to assign values to the columns order date and env date. This is an example of creating and using a macro called option defaults. This macro sets 4 Golden Gate process parameters. The example is calling the macro and therefore all those parameters take effect. The second line issues the ignore updates parameter, which will cancel the effect of getUpdates parameter set by the macro. The next mapping between the source table hr.src tab and the target table hr.targ tab will be affected by the ignore updates parameter. Then the macro is called again, and after that there is a mapping between the src tab2 and trg tab2 tables. For this mapping, the parameter getUpdates take effect. Macro can be saved in files, and those files can then be included in the Golden Gate parameter files. You save the macro library file with the mac extension. Use the include parameter at the beginning of a parameter file so that all the macros in the library file will be seen by the parameter file. By default, the output of the macro library is listed in the report file. This may lead to have large report file size. Use the list and no-list parameters to turn the listing on and off. Those parameters can be called within the parameter file or within the macro library file itself. For debugging purposes, you may need to enable tracing a macro operation. You control tracing macro expansion using the CMD trace parameter. The available values for this parameter are self-descriptive. If you set the parameter to on, the tracing will be on, and the macro expansion steps will be displayed in the report file. If you set the parameter to off, the trace will be disabled. This value is the default value. If you set it to detail, the tracing will be on, and it will generate more tracing details. The example in the slide is enabling the trace before running the macro. It is turned back off after the macro is finished. There is an area in the trail record header called User Token Area. You can save any pieces of information in that area. The records saved in that area are called tokens. You typically create the tokens by the extract process in the source system and save information about the source database in those tokens. You can save information like operating system user, the host name, or the value of any environment variable. The replicate process in the target system side can read the values of those tokens and use them for anything like saving them in some target columns. To create a token, you use the tokens clause of the table parameter. You specify the token name and assign its value. You can create more than one token for a single table parameter. The size of the whole token area in the trail record header should not exceed 2000 bytes. On the target side, you use the token function to retrieve the value of the tokens and save them in the target columns through the map or CallMap parameters. In the example shown in the slide, the extract process is creating tokens. It saves the operating system username, group name, and the host name into those tokens. In the target side, the replicate is reading this information and save them in 3 target columns. Notice that the extract process uses getinv function to obtain the information it needs about the source environment. That's it for this practice. You have learned how to use macros and how to use user tokens. You will implement those concepts in the next practice lecture. See you over there. Thank you very much.